back on the air. We've known each other for over 20 years. I know you as a friend, and here's something I didn't know, is that you're funny.
He said yes to nothing. That's the detail almost nobody talked about when Stephen Colbert walked away from CBS. Not a rival network. Not a streaming deal. Not even a friend's open invitation to sit behind a familiar desk on a familiar stage, in front of a familiar audience. Jimmy Kimmel offered him exactly that, a chance to stay visible, to keep working, to keep the lights on. And Colbert turned it down. For a man who had just lost the biggest platform of his career, that decision looked, at first glance, almost irrational. But the deeper you dig into what actually happened between these two comedians in the summer of 2025, the more that refusal starts to look like the most honest thing Stephen Colbert has done in years. To understand why that offer mattered so much, you have to go back to the moment everything fell apart. On July 17, 2025, CBS announced that The Late Show with Stephen Colbert would end when his contract expired the following May. This wasn't a show limping along in fourth place, quietly put out of its misery. This was the #1 program in network late night, a show that had spent 9 consecutive seasons beating Jimmy Fallon on NBC and Jimmy Kimmel himself on ABC. CBS's own president, George Cheeks, had publicly called Colbert the network's top performer in that time slot. And yet the show was ending anyway, with CBS insisting, almost too quickly, that the decision was purely financial, a byproduct of a late-night business that had been bleeding advertising revenue for years. Maybe that explanation would have held up on its own, in another year, under different circumstances. But circumstances were not cooperating. Just 3 days before the cancellation was announced, Colbert had stood on his own stage and criticized his own employer, calling out Paramount Global's decision to settle a lawsuit brought by Donald Trump over how 60 Minutes had edited an interview with Kamala Harris. Paramount agreed to pay $16 million toward Trump's future presidential library. Colbert didn't hold back. He told his audience, as someone who considered himself a proud employee of the network, he was offended. Then he called the settlement a big fat bribe. The studio audience laughed and applauded. The rest of the industry did not find it quite so funny, because at that exact moment, Paramount was in the middle of trying to close an $8 billion merger with Skydance Media, a deal that needed sign-off from federal regulators, including the Federal Communications Commission. 3 days later, Colbert's show was cancelled. CBS said the timing was coincidental. Almost nobody in the industry believed that entirely, and the people who came to Colbert's defense weren't fringe voices. David Letterman, the man whose desk Colbert had inherited a decade earlier, criticized the network's decision publicly. Senator Elizabeth Warren raised questions about the circumstances surrounding it. And two of the most recognizable names in late-night comedy, Jon Stewart and Jimmy Kimmel, spoke up for their colleague almost immediately. Kimmel's response went further than words. On the night of Colbert's farewell broadcast, rather than airing a new episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live in direct competition, Kimmel chose to run a rerun instead, and he actively encouraged his own viewers to go watch Colbert's final show. In an industry built on ratings competition, where every viewer counted, that was not a small gesture. It was a comedian voluntarily stepping back from his own turf so a rival could have the spotlight on his way out the door. And it set the stage for what came next, an offer that on paper looked generous, even selfless, and that Colbert quietly turned down. According to Kimmel, speaking afterward to Variety, he had invited Colbert to join Jimmy Kimmel Live as one of the rotating guest hosts who typically fill in during Kimmel's annual summer hiatus. It was a natural fit. Colbert had just lost his platform. Kimmel had won, and he was offering to share it. No strings attached, no long-term commitment required. For most performers in that position, fresh off a public and controversial exit, it would have been an easy way to stay in front of an audience while figuring out what came next. Instead, Colbert said no. Kimmel didn't frame the rejection as a rift between them. Quite the opposite. He explained that Colbert simply felt it was too soon. 2 words. That was the entire admission, at least as it was relayed publicly. But those 2 words carry more weight than they first appear to, because they suggest something that runs against the grain of how show business usually operates. In an industry where visibility is currency, where disappearing from screens for even a few weeks can be treated as a career risk, Colbert chose absence. He chose to step away completely rather than borrow someone else's stage while the wound was still fresh. Kimmel, for his part, left the door open in the most unambiguous way possible. He told Colbert that the invitation wasn't a one-time thing, that whenever he was ready, whenever he wanted to sit behind that desk, Kimmel would gladly step aside and let him do it. It wasn't a polite, throwaway offer either. Kimmel understood, probably better than almost anyone else in the industry, exactly what Colbert was going through, because a matter of weeks later, he found himself living through his own version of it. In September of 2025, ABC abruptly pulled Jimmy Kimmel Live off the air after a monologue in which Kimmel addressed the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. The characterization that spread fastest online, that Kimmel had mocked or celebrated Kirk's death, was not accurate. What he had actually done was criticize what he saw as an effort by some figures on the right to immediately reframe the shooter's identity and motives for political advantage, arguing that segments of the MAGA movement were trying to score points off a tragedy rather than simply mourn it. The nuance didn't survive the news cycle. Conservative commentators, politicians, and major ABC affiliate groups including Nexstar and Sinclair accused him of being insensitive, and the backlash escalated fast enough that ABC suspended the show indefinitely while it sorted out what to do. The suspension became its own national story almost overnight. More than 400 actors, writers, comedians, and producers signed an open letter, backed by the American Civil Liberties Union, condemning the decision as an attack on free expression. Notably, some of the people defending Kimmel's right to speak were viewers and public figures who didn't even agree with his politics. President Trump, on the other hand, welcomed ABC's decision, and FCC Chairman Brendan Carr publicly criticized Kimmel's remarks, though Carr later denied that federal regulators had pressured the network behind the scenes. 6 days after the suspension began, ABC reversed course and brought Jimmy Kimmel Live back, saying the initial pause had been meant to avoid inflaming an already tense moment, and that conversations with Kimmel had led them to conclude the show should return. Kimmel's return broadcast was raw. He addressed the controversy directly, visibly emotional at points, telling his audience it had never been his intention to make light of a young man's murder, that he didn't find anything about it funny, and that he had sent a message of sympathy to Charlie Kirk's family the moment he heard what happened, a message he said he still meant completely. He made clear that his criticism had never targeted Kirk himself, only the people he believed were using the tragedy to score political points. He thanked the people who had defended his right to speak even when they disagreed with what he'd said. Put Colbert's story next to Kimmel's, and a pattern starts to emerge that neither man asked for but both of them lived through. Two of the most prominent, most consistently critical voices against Donald Trump in late-night television found themselves, within roughly 2 months of each other, losing their platforms under circumstances that both networks insisted had nothing to do with politics. Both men had spent years absorbing Trump's public attacks, being called boring, untalented, finished, only to keep winning their time slots anyway. Both became the subject of intense national debate about whether corporate pressure, regulatory politics, or simple economics were reshaping what late-night hosts were allowed to say. It's not hard to understand, against that backdrop, why an offer from Kimmel might feel different to Colbert than an ordinary industry favor. It would have meant stepping into another comedian's chair at the exact moment their two situations were being compared, dissected, and politicized by people who had never watched either show a day in their lives. So instead, Colbert stepped back entirely. Since leaving CBS, he has not signed on with another network. He has not announced a streaming deal. He has not launched a podcast, despite plenty of speculation that he might. What he has done is quieter. A lifelong admirer of J.R.R. Tolkien, his serving as an executive producer on The Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum, work that keeps him creatively engaged without putting him back under a nightly spotlight built for political commentary. It's a strange kind of exit for a man who spent 9 years as the most watched host in his time slot, choosing quiet, deliberate absence over a fast return to visibility. There's something worth sitting with in that choice, something that goes beyond ratings and contracts and corporate statements about financial pressure. Stephen Colbert's life has always carried an undercurrent of loss that shaped how he processes public moments. Long before any of this, in 1974, a 10-year-old Colbert lost his father and 2 of his brothers when Eastern Airlines Flight 212 crashed on approach to Charlotte, North Carolina. He has spoken about that loss many times over the years, most memorably in a conversation with Anderson Cooper, another public figure who understood grief from the inside. Colbert told Cooper that he had come to feel grateful, in a strange way, for the thing he wished had never happened, because it had deepened his sense of empathy and his appreciation for the people still in his life. That is not the language of someone who processes hard moments by rushing past them. It's the language of someone who has learned, the hard way, that some things need time before they can be turned into anything resembling comedy. Maybe that's the simplest explanation for why he said no to Jimmy Kimmel. Not caution about optics. Not fear of comparison. Just an honest recognition that the wound from losing The Late Show, a job that had defined nearly a decade of his public life and had ended under circumstances still debated across newsrooms and Senate offices, wasn't something he could walk into someone else's studio and perform through yet. Kimmel seemed to understand that instinctively, which is why his offer never came with a deadline. Anytime you want to host, he told him, I'll gladly step aside. Whether Colbert ever takes him up on it remains an open question. What isn't in question is the kind of friendship the offer revealed, one built less on ratings rivalries than on a shared understanding of exactly how brutal this industry can be to the people who speak too plainly inside it. Two comedians who spent years needling the same president, defending each other under real professional pressure, and ultimately deciding that some doors are worth leaving open, even when the other person isn't ready to walk through them. In an industry known for burning bridges the moment ratings shift, that's the part of this story that deserves to be remembered long after the headlines about cancellations and settlements fade away.